I want to make sure we get some time for questions from the audience. So if you have questions for the panelists, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought around to you. Right here.
Hi, my name is Fred Kent. I'm with Project for Public Spaces. We work on libraries all over the world, or public spaces. And there's three quick examples. In Winnipeg, there's a whole bunch of African cultures coming into that city, different black African cultures. And they go to the library. And what they began to realize is that they needed to do more than just go to the library. So they put a market, an African market outside the library. And that really started, it was because the library was there, they were able to do that. Another librarian in Richmond, British Columbia, said he had to move out of his library into a large space that was kind of like a Walmart type space with other cultural institutions. And he said, we really served the community because they would come into the building and then they would find different places to go to, but it wasn't just the library that they would go to. They might go to some cultural activity. And then in Perth, Australia, the state librarian has a very big building. She decided to take all the library functions off of the ground floor, create a town square in a larger cultural center, and draw people in that way, but have various aspects of the library in that space, but other kinds of activity as well. And so Canadian librarians are really progressive about being in the communities. We're working on activating a Houston library, and the main library in Houston, with an activation event that Southwest Airlines is sponsoring. So there's all these ways where the library can become part of a town square. And maybe there's aspects of a community center in there, but there's so many other things that go on in the town square that libraries could be an integral part of and a major resource for.
Fred, so, was there a question there?
Well, the question is, I think you're talking about the library in a building, mostly, except for you. I don't know your name, ma'am, but the future of libraries may be better to look at the building and its context within a community, and how all of these activities may go on with the library as a center of that. Mm-hmm. So that's a question.
Yes. That was what I was trying to argue with the basketball court, putting it on that. I think there are lots of ways in which that's important.
But then the architecture of the future of libraries may be very different than it is in the past.
I think there was a question right up here. Yeah, right here.
I read about the bond problems in Chicago, the financial problems in Chicago and Illinois, and yet I don't hear that resonating through your commentary. Do you have a different way of being funded, or am I missing something?
Well, I didn't necessarily want to get into all the finances of Chicago, but I will. So, Chicago libraries, like any other, well, Chicago as a city has been struggling financially and hopefully is coming out of it. We at Chicago Public actually saw significant reductions in 2009 and in 2011 that resulted in reduction in hours. We have been able to bring many of those hours back, and part of the reason we've been able to do it was through restructuring and reorganizing, and also part of it was to help the mayor and help the city council see the important role that the libraries was playing in the city. The thing is about Chicago Public Library, just to give you a sense, I mean, it costs about $100 million to run the library. And that sounds like a big number, depending on the community that you're in. But when you look at what it costs to run the Chicago Public Schools, $6 billion, we're a tiny piece of a very expensive, large, sprawling city. And it turns out, at least in the view of city council and our mayor, in my view, is that tiny investment in libraries is these anchors, community, in neighborhoods, as well as playing a really important role in the after-school and out-of-school time learning, has been an effective argument for keeping funding in place. But it doesn't mean that we haven't experienced the economic downturn. I mean, one of the other challenges that we have on content is that our collections budget in Chicago is a little less than what we had in San Francisco, and we're 3 times the size. So we definitely have some financial challenges, and depending on what happens with pension reform in Chicago, they may be even deeper.
I think the key in a way, though, is that you're a cheap date. Brian, the marginal cost of what really makes a difference in the library isn't such a big deal in the school system, right? Or whatever. I mean,
it's the 80-20.
Right, our high school costs $100 million to run, and you run the entire city of, Chicago's public library system, right? There's much more margin and leverage in giving you another $6 million.
So a question right here.
I just came from the Rem Koolhaus Library in Seattle, and one of the biggest problems they have there is, and they see it as a problem, is the homelessness. They all gather within the library, and they are in the process right now of looking for answers to what do we do with this, because it's pervasive within all 6 floors. So one of the ideas they have, and I'd like to know if any of you have any new and innovative ideas, one of the ideas they have is to relegate a space with showers and bathrooms and washers and dryers and so forth within the library. What do you think about that, and do you have any new and updated ideas on that issue?
So, my thoughts on that, sort of similar to the high school question. I'm not totally sure that it's the role of the library to serve also as a shelter for homeless. I do think it's a really important question that libraries get, at least the ones that I've worked in. When you're in an urban setting, homelessness is part of the urban challenge, as is violence and so many other things. I do think it's important that we see libraries as public spaces that are open to all, regardless of who they are or their background. And that we don't start this sort of process of segregating and saying, well, we're going to create rules to highly discourage you from coming in and more encourage you. But one of the things I saw in San Francisco that we experimented with that was actually quite successful was actually bringing in people that would work with homeless to identify services outside the library that existed to support them. And so we brought in social workers, and that was their job. And so rather than trying to create a shelter within the library or segregate various different populations in different places of the library, it was a more connecting them to the services that already exist in the city. I think that's probably the approach that I would go towards. But every city looks at that in a different way.
There's a question back here. Can you get a microphone there?
Good morning. Brian, as you well know, there's a great deal of discussion and debate about where the Obama Library should go.
Chicago.
Of course. I'm really just pointing to where in Chicago the Obama Library should go.
Well, we don't know that.
Exactly. But with that in mind, and just having been in Grand Rapids and visited the Ford Presidential Library, what do you guys think in general about how we can make these presidential libraries less a monument to an individual and more a way of engaging the populace around civic issues, citizenship, access, et cetera? What recommendations would you make to that committee about how the library should play out?
It's a great question. Well, I think presidential libraries, they're called libraries, and I think in some instances they perform as libraries. But I'm really excited by the prospect of wherever the Obama Library ends up, whether it's Chicago or somewhere else, that it really would aspire to something like what you just suggested, that it would be a place to learn about democracy, to engage in democracy, to see it in action. I think it would be great if that was happening in an urban space that you could actually see it live as opposed to sort of off in some remote place. We've actually been in discussions with all 3 of the institutions that are wanting to bring the Obama Library to Chicago about what role the public library might play in supporting those activities. And I think once the decision is made about where it goes, whether Chicago or somewhere else, and if it's in Chicago, that we hope to have a role in helping on that more public side of it. Because I agree it's a really important part of Obama's legacy, but also I think it's an important part of a presidential libraries and their mission.
I think here's an opportunity to think about, again, it's, when it would get started in terms of its, sort of building and design. It could be more of a digital virtual library, presidential library. I mean, you think about, the uses of technology that the Obama administration has brought into, very stark relief, and its ability, hopefully, to sort of project into the future. And so, being a virtual library, in addition to having some, physical presence, and allowing for that discussion around democracy or the participation in democracy be more than just in one place, one city, but really sort of permeating across the U.S. because it is the President of the United States and not just Honolulu or Chicago or wherever they might decide to locate it.
I would argue strongly for this blended approach, particularly with this president, in the sense that I think his election initially was one of the times really in our history where somebody combined beautifully digital organizing with on the street, door knocking, right? In some respects, this hybrid thing is a big part of his legacy. I also have not talked about my pet project or many of our pet project, which is the Digital Public Library of America. This is an effort to create a national digital library. It has happened during Obama's presidency. Actually, two of the huge drivers of this have been the National Archives as well as the Smithsonian, which are big, obviously federal players. The National Archives oversees the presidential libraries, and David Ferriero, who's the Archivist of the United States, has been really the #1 champion of building this National Digital Library. And I actually could imagine a really cool statement that says, one of the things that happened during the president's tenure was to create this national platform for libraries digitally, and also really connect it to a space in his hometown of Chicago. And I think you could do something really incredibly cool that speaks to the future of libraries as platforms and as places in a meaningful way. I think it's like tailor-built for that.
It's got to be Chicago, right?
Got to be Chicago. They've got to have a digital.
I think we have time for one
too.
last question. How about right here? You want a microphone here?
In these times with still tight budgets and tough decisions about what content to buy and in what format, I'm wondering how patron-driven acquisition programs and other data that libraries now have is being used to tailor the acquisition programs. To what extent? And how is that information being used to push back to publishers about what to publish and how to price it and how to make it available?
Yeah, so there's two. So I'll start with that one. So patron-driven acquisitions, for those of you who are not librarians in the room, I suspect no, you're not? A publisher it's a way basically for us to buy when a patron asks for it, as opposed to thinking that there'll be demand and then doing a bunch of mass purchasing. So definitely, the patron-driven acquisition, floating collections, a variety of ways that we're looking at how we can more efficiently use that resource. And I actually think that's one of the silver linings of a reduced budget, is that it makes you become much more creative about the resources that you have. The question around publishers is it's a tough question. I mean, each library on their own doesn't have the negotiating power that a library as a collective has. But libraries as collectives all have various different views, and there's some libraries, I'm not going to name them, that will go off and work with publishers separately and negotiate something for their own city, but it doesn't extend to all cities. So I think it's a great challenge to libraries to be more collaborative in how we work with publishers. At the end of the day, we want to make the information available. We also want publishers to be successful in their business model. So I think there's a way to do both. We just haven't gotten there yet.
We haven't talked that much about libraries' roles as creating the long-term preservation of knowledge, and we've talked mostly about access, which is natural since we're talking about public libraries, but I think we need to keep both in mind, which is the role of providing access and the role of preservation. And actually this question I think really drives at it, which is if all you did as libraries were to provide exactly what everybody thinks they want at that moment and didn't think about this sort of keeper of knowledge role, and maybe this idea of serendipity, that you would present somebody a book they didn't think they knew they wanted and they happened to see it on a shelf and they were to take it. So I just think as we go forward, I think patron-driven acquisition is a really interesting idea and a good one in some respects. I think libraries and publishers need to make common cause to get through this transitional period, and I actually think there is a collective action issue there that could be interesting. But at the same time, I think we have to just recall that many publishers go out of business, and as a library director, I was shocked by 3 or 4 times in 4 years publishers came to me and said, you have copies of things that we own the rights to, but we don't literally have them. We need copies of them back so we can make digital copies. 3 or 4 times, major publishers, who had eventually acquired them. The other thing is that, the digital library, or the Library of Alexandria doesn't exist, right? The Library of Pergamon doesn't exist anymore. The grand libraries of the world, they get destroyed somehow. We actually need a system that ensures that in this digital era, we're actually preserving all this knowledge as well as making it available.
This is where you go a little bit down that slippery slope I mentioned about the marketplace of the future being driven by the analytics of consumers, the documentation of consumers' tastes, and such, deciding what products get brought to the market. And there is a need for sort of a human element, in all of that, so that it doesn't just become about algorithm.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.